Good afternoon from Bangkok, everyone, and good evening, good morning from wherever you are. My name is Vithada Anukul Wataka. I'm economist in Trade Policy and Facilitation section of ESCAP, and I'm the coordinator of this course, and I will be the moderator today. Thank you everyone who joined the previous live session. I hope you have gone through the material at least for part A modules. And I saw many of you have made good progress with the quiz and the lectures, watching the lecture videos. So if you have questions when you are doing that, you can put in the chats and we will check it out and just bring it up for further discussions or reply. And today again, we have Professor Ian. You meet Ian already on Monday. So I will give the floor to Ian, who will be lead the discussion. Ian, please.
Thank you, Vitada. I'm going to share my screen if I can. And let's see. And hopefully you can all see this now. So let's see. Slideshow. Okay. Is that okay? You can see that?
Yes, I can see that.
Good. Yeah.
Ian,
okay.
Just 1 minute. I forgot to mention one housekeeping rule.
Okay.
For any of you who log in to this live sessions, and if your names appear on the MS Team not in English, would you mind drop your name in the chat in English, please? Because we will use English to check with the certificates.
Okay. Are we ready now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, good. So welcome everybody. As Vitada said, my name is Ian Coxhead. I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States, and I'm also at the Institute of Developing Economies, IDE-JETRO, in Tokyo, Japan. That's where I'm sitting right now in Tokyo, so it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. My employer, IDE-JETRO, asks me to remind you that anything I say today, I say in a personal capacity and not as a representative of their institution. So with that behind us, welcome back to the second live session of our course on trade and the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to begin with just a very brief set of reminders of the content of the course. And a little bit of discussion before I turn it over to you. This session today is really about you, your questions and your discussion. So we'll get to that very soon. Before we do, then let me just advance my slides. Well, there's our familiar SDG board. Remember that the aim of this course is twofold. We're interested in the links between the Sustainable Development Goals and international trade in developing countries. And this caused us to ask these two really important questions. The first one, what are the fundamental links between trade and achievement of the SDGs? And second, does trade help or does it hinder efforts to attain the SDGs? And we're asking these questions in part because the documents regarding the SDGs, the statements of the SDGs and the listing of their targets have very little to say about international trade. But at the same time, we know that international trade is a very important part of every developing economy. So that leaves it to us, that leaves a gap that we're going to try to fill with this course, thinking about linkages between trade and achieving the SDGs. And the big challenge that we face here is that there are some direct effects of trade on SDG targets, for example, creating employment or generating foreign exchange or some other targets of that kind. But most of the linkages between trade and SDG targets are indirect or implicit. That is, they operate through some intermediary mechanism. And for that reason, it's often very difficult to identify the effects of trade on the SDGs. That's what this course is all about. So let me turn now to the 4 introductory modules. These are the ones that we asked you to review for today's session. And I'm just going to say just a couple of things about each of those 4 modules. Starting with the first module, A1, which is an overview. In there, the main points are, first, that trade increases incomes and productivity in every country that engages in trade. Second, that trade is complementary with many of the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially with the very big goals, for example, SDG 1, ending poverty, and SDG 2, ending hunger as we know it. However, trade may also be contradictory with some of the other SDGs, for example, environmental targets or the target of decent work. And this is going to come out if there is some other problem in a country. For example, if an element such as an institution or a set of institutions or rules that govern natural resource use or that ensure labour rights is missing or is weakly enforced. So we're going to spend a lot of time in this course thinking about that, and A1 provides an initial viewpoint on that. Module A.2 is mostly focused on providing some tools that we need to use for our analysis. And what I've done here is introduce 3 very basic economic principles. The principle of opportunity cost, that is, there is no free lunch. The principle of comparative advantage, which we remind ourselves is like, do what you do, do well. And the principle of increasing opportunity cost, which is first pick the low-hanging fruit. And these 3 principles, plus a few others, but mostly these 3, guide the way that we understand and assess the effects of trade or trade policies on economies and therefore on the SDGs as well. A2 also reminds us that trade may redistribute income and opportunity, so there are always going to be gainers and losers from international trade. And third, A2 reminds us that market failures, for example, environmental externalities, may have the effect of breaking a positive link between trade and the SDGs. So lots of issues in there for us to think about. The third and the fourth modules. The third module is an early introduction to trade and environmental SDGs. And what we do in there mostly is we provide a means to decompose the effects of trade on the environment. And we do that by noting that any kind of effect from trade or any kind of economic effect at all on the environment can be broken down into 3 parts: a scale effect, a composition effect, and a technique effect. And as you would have seen when you reviewed these modules, the scale effect is just gross size. If the economy gets bigger and nothing else changes, then of course the demand for environmental assets such as forests or clean air and water grows at the same pace. But if the structure of the economy changes, for example, one industry grows faster and another slower, then that composition effect may also affect the environment. If the faster growing industry is dirty and the other industries are clean, then the composition effect may lead to increased environmental damage, for example. And then finally, you would have seen that technique effects are about changes in technology or changes in consumer preferences, which alter the pattern of demand or the means of production of each good. And to the extent that different goods that we produce are cleaner or dirtier, that's also going to have environmental effects. So every kind of effect of trade can be broken down into these 3 effects, and it's helpful for us to do so. Finally, A4 looks at trade policies and trade policy reforms. And here we notice that trade liberalization pretty much always promotes more efficiency and greater specialization. And so there are going to be income gains associated with that. But once again, just as with trade itself, if we liberalize trade, if we change trade policy, there are going to be winners as well as losers. And the module points out that the easiest or the most direct way to understand that is to think about who earns income from what kind of productive asset. Because a trade policy reform that, for example, increases the returns to low-skilled labor will be good for blue-collar workers who earn a lot of their income from low-skilled labor, but it may be bad for owners of other productive assets, for example, capital. Finally, A4 also reminds us that a lot of the indirect effects of trade operate through things like the fiscal accounts of the government, tax revenues, patterns of spending, and so on. And lastly, that module also introduces the idea of trade agreements and their effects on trade, and it highlights that there are different kinds of trade agreements out there now. Old-style agreements focused on tariffs and other border measures and had really nothing to say about labor rights or poverty or environment. But new style trade agreements, 21st century agreements, typically have a lot to say about such behind the border measures and may include explicit conditions on things like environment or labor standards. So the new style FTAs, the new style trade agreements, provide a lot more support for SDG targets. Okay, that's all I want to say by way of introduction. This session is really for you. So let me now turn it over to you. I'll stop sharing screen and I'll ask you to pose your questions or your discussion points in the chat. So take it away.
Thank you, Ian. I see 2 questions in the chat already, and also some hands up. So let me call Bakari. You put a questions about SDG on equality. How does SDG ensure that it's win-win for trade? Would you like to explain your questions a bit?
Usually in trade, there is always a winner and a loser. On the SDG on quality, how does the SDG on quality, as regards trade, how does it ensure that both partners are able to be in an almost win-win situation? I don't know if that makes it.
That's a terrific question. So you've really you've nailed the fundamental ambiguity about the relationship between trade and the SDGs. If there are both winners and losers, then it's possible that inequality in a country might rise, or indeed possible that it may fall as a result of increased trade. So first thing is, that's going to depend a lot on who gains and who loses. Imagine an economy which has very high tariff protection. Inevitably, in the developing world, tariffs are applied to industries that are not competitive in the country, ones that cannot compete with global markets. So the beneficiaries of such tariffs are almost always the owners of very scarce inputs to production, which means capital or in some cases skills. So when we liberalize trade, we actually reduce the extent of protection on these least competitive industries. Now, what does that do? Well, it changes the pattern of demand for different inputs to production. The demand for capital is going to fall, and as a result of that, the incomes of capital owners will rise by less, or indeed may even fall. So in that case, inequality would actually fall, because we know that owners of capital tend to be wealthy people within the economy. What about the more important case, which is that trade is associated with increases in inequality? In that case, the primary mechanism for repairing that problem would go through the fiscal accounts. That is, government would have to figure out ways to tax and to spend according to the pattern of inequality change. So
my question was related to thanks, Ian. My question was related to the past literature where economic growth has that positive relationship with environmental degradation, particularly for developing countries. Now let's assume that we have to achieve the environmental SDGs, and even countries like Pakistan, where I can say that previous government banned the plastic bags and shifted towards the degradable bags or the clothing type of bags. So how we can connect the dots and bring in trade and environment together?
Yeah. Wow. That's a question with so many dimensions. I hardly know where to begin. So thank you for that, Shrutat. So the question, if anyone had trouble hearing, is about the scale effect of trade, right? So if we get more trade and therefore more economic activity, that's going to increase pollution and other kinds of environmental bads. Did I get that right, Shujat?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So one point that we make several times in this course is that there are really two things going on there. The scale effect of trade, or indeed the scale effect of economic growth generally, is something which is going to increase demand for natural resources, increase air pollution, increase demand for scarce water resources and everything else. And that by itself is going to lead to environmental damage and, of course, failure to achieve environmental SDGs. How do we solve that? Well, some people have said we should solve that by turning away from trade. They blame trade for the increase in environmental damage. I think, and the course emphasizes, that this is probably the wrong approach. What's really needed is effective regulation of environmental resource use in such a way as to ensure that if there is going to be increased environmental damage from economic growth or from trade, then there has to be a regulatory system in place that prevents that from happening, at least beyond the level that society is willing to accept. So think about deforestation, for example. That's a popular topic. The rest of the world would like to buy timber from your country. If there was no regulation in place, then the forests would be all cut down and put on ships and sent away to some other country. And that scale effect of trade would have huge environmental damages. So you could try banning timber exports, and that might be effective, at least for a while, although more likely it would just lead to smuggling. A better way, and the way that makes more long-term sense, is to ensure that the forestry industry is regulated in such a way as to manage that forest in a sustainable way. And in the course, we refer to this several times as the two targets, two instrument problem. If you want to have gains from trade and you also want to protect your environment, that's two targets. And in order to achieve those two targets, you've got to use two instruments. In this case, that would be liberalize trade, but also improve the regulatory system for managing the environmental assets. So that's the short answer to what I think is a very complex set of questions implied by your question. Thank you for asking it. Witada, if you or anyone else wants to jump in as well, then please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I'm about to say is that Ian mentions about two instruments. Sometimes in the material, you would also find the terms of complementary approach or complementary policies. So that is the same thing. Like you have trade policies, making trade growing to get more financial resource to invest in achieving SDGs. But on the other hand, you also need other policy that address the negative or side effects of trade. And regulation is something under the context of complementary policies or the term of instruments, additional instruments. Yeah. And in addition to having regulation, I think Ian also means enforcement, because we have many countries that have legislations, but when you look into how the law actually implement or enforce, it's another story.
I'd like to add one more thing as well, because as we speak, you know that COP27 is underway in Egypt, right? So COP27 is yet another round of talks aimed at defining and finding rules to achieve environmental targets or climate change targets for the world as a whole. And it's really striking to me in everything that I read coming out of Egypt, coming out of COP27, really striking that trade plays almost no role in those discussions. And you know, for me it's striking because you choose any country except, let's say, North Korea, and the thing that you notice is that international trade always amounts to no less than 30% of GDP, and usually much more. So if trade is so important to income and to expenditure and to everything else in an economy, then how can we even sensibly begin to talk about defining and setting and achieving climate change goals without talking about the contribution of trade to those goals. I'm really, frankly, very shocked that international trade does not play a much bigger role in the conversation in Egypt at COP27.
Thanks, Ian. Because we are about, discuss on environmental issues a lot during this question. So I will pick from chat ones that mentions environment, and then we deal with this. Jeffrey has mentioned in chat about digital economy agreement, green economy agreements, and FTA, and the effects it brings to SDG. I'm not sure because he mentioned so many types of agreement, but yes, green economy agreement is a new modern type of agreements that's come into the news recently. Jeffrey, would you like to bring your point up?
Yeah, I was just thinking because some of the newer economies like Singapore, as I'm from Singapore itself, has already gone into digital economy agreement and green economy agreement with many countries, including UK, Australia. So my take of it is that how does that has an impact to the SDG itself, which typically free trade agreements only looks at the traditional trades and the tariff barriers and stuff, that has been going at the non-tariff barriers. So how that has a relationship or direct relationship to the SDG in terms of the newer type of free trade agreements that come into play?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Jeffrey. Which country are you in, by the way?
Singapore.
Oh, you are in Singapore. Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at the background behind you, trying to figure it out. Okay.
The capital of digital agreement.
What's that?
Singapore is the capital of the digital type agreement.
I get it. So there's a brief reference in module A4 to kind of what we're calling old and new style trade agreements. And in a later module, we're going to spend a lot more time looking at new style trade agreements. That's going to be in module, I'm just checking now, module B4. And there's a lot more detail in module B4 about what we're calling new style trade agreements. So old style was just looking at tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So basically looking at measures that are applied at the border when goods cross the border. New style trade agreements are almost without exception these days far more detailed in terms of what we think of as behind the border measures. Now, these may have to do with regulatory institutions like government procurement or things like that. But increasingly, or almost without exception, they also include things like environmental standards. So take, for example, the CPTPP, the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. That has about 24 chapters, and one of those chapters is entirely dedicated to environmental questions. And so the signatories to that agreement and others similar to it are agreeing not only to enforce border trade regulations with each other, but also to apply environmental standards to production and to trade. And this is, I think, a very positive indicator. I think there's still a lot of bugs to work out in these kinds of agreements in terms of enforceability, measuring success, all of that kind of thing. But at least they're going in that direction. So they're linking trade explicitly to environmental goals, which should make it easier to achieve SDG outcomes at the same time. And of course, if we think about regional or bilateral agreements or agreements like the European EBA, the Everything But Arms agreements, or the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP and GSP+, those also contain environmental standards. And so GSP+, which is I think a tool favored by the Europeans for their dealings with poorer countries in the world, has a lot of regulatory content built into it, including environmental standards. And if you don't meet the EU's standards for environmental protection, then they threaten you with withdrawal of your GSP trade benefits as well. So I think that's the way things are going. And again, you know, enforceability, measurability, these are big issues, but at least the direction of change is in the right way. Thank you for that question.
I agree with you. And many of these agreements take the approach of open agreements. Mean when you're ready, you sign up, and then it is likely that it signal of easier trade between those who sign up, and stimulate other countries who doesn't want to miss the bandwagon as well. I see questions from Yuchana. She mentions about developing countries' perspectives in the context of scale, compositions, and technique effects. She asks, what are these effects means for developing countries?
Okay. Does Yuchana want to flesh out her question a little?
Yuchana, would you like to explain, or you are okay with?
Yeah, hi. In the way I was thinking about this, I just kept thinking about when I was doing the course, effects that those scale composition. So I know, for example, scale, they said if pollution, you would have, with trade, increase economic activity, you have more pollution. But I was wondering if I think I was comparing it to developed countries. I think that's what I was thinking in my head. So, when you think of each of the effects, I'm not quite sure how I execute it now. And when you think of each of the effects, do they, I don't know, is there anyone that is better for a developing country? Or is there anyone that is notably, I don't know, I guess, maybe I can think about the question a bit. But I think I was wondering kind of if there, in any particular area, whether there variation in the way you have observed this in developed countries.
I can't really hear what
I could hear only parts of your question, Yuchana. I'm sorry. Let me read back what I think I heard and tell me if I'm on the right track. It sounded like you're interested in the comparison or the contrast between wealthy industrialized countries and developing countries in terms of scale, composition, and technique effects from trade. Is that right?
Yes.
Am I on the right track?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Wasn't sure about the rest of your question. It sounded a little bit like which would be the dominant effects that we would expect to see in developing countries. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let me answer what I think I heard you ask, and if I'm off track, then just tell me so. The answer is going to be it really varies case to case. So let's take an extreme case. Think about a country where government is very weak and the regulatory system is very weak and capacity to enforce regulations are very weak. So that's a country with very poor institutions, okay? In that case, it's really easy, it's low cost for someone who has the means and the incentive to degrade the environment for profit. So someone can engage in mining or deforestation or overfishing or polluting of waterways without any real fear of a penalty. So if institutions of that kind, regulatory and enforcement institutions, are very weak, then the scale effect is likely to be the dominant effect of trade. And that's going to be a bad outcome, obviously. And as a footnote, let me just register that recent evaluations of global progress towards the SDGs show partial success on things like ending hunger and poverty, and almost no progress or even backsliding in terms of progress towards the environmental SDGs. So this is a major issue globally, as well as in every country as well. Now, if it's really weak institutions, then we can see the other end of that contrast. Take a wealthy country like Singapore or Luxembourg or Switzerland or someplace like that, where institutions are very strong. The costs of polluting or degrading the environment are very, very high. In that case, increased trade is not going to have negative environmental effects because no firm or individual is going to find it worthwhile to take the risk of doing that. So what we learn from that is that it's really not about trade. Trade creates incentives to deplete natural resources or to produce pollution, but trade by itself is not the entire story. What we really need is to look at the combination of trade incentives and institutional or policy measures that are in place for any country and for any sector or any specific environmental asset in that country. I hope I've managed to answer your question adequately. Have I done so?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I think that if you make that has to be, that's why I'm struggling. And because the person that we are, they take back his baby, and then you can have the institution have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Uchana. If you want to follow up on that, then please go to the course website and put something in the chat there, and we'll try to address it directly from there as well.
Yes, and I still have issue hearing audio from Archana. So I have to move on to other questions. I saw Jeffrey mentions about green supply chains, supply chain resiliencies with the relationship with SDGs. I think we can also have further discussion on GVC issues on the 28th, because we will have Biswajit, who is the supply chain expert. So Jeffrey, please bring this issue up again.
Yeah.
Let's move on to other dimensions of SDG as well, because we have only 1 hour here, right? I see many questions, especially from Wajit. Wajit, you want to bring example of Bangladesh FDI to the class? Please have your mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very well.
Thank you. Basically, I was wondering, you mentioned the example of Cambodia and Bangladesh, but to the best of my knowledge, Bangladesh doesn't have that much FDI in terms of their RMG industry. That was the first issue. And the second issue is more relevant to today's topic, because there are many platinum certified, platinum certified RMG factories, and their owners complain that we're trying to be environment friendly, but it's not fetching us higher prices. So where's our incentive? Thank you.
Okay, 2 good questions. Witad, maybe I'll hand the first one off to you because you're the expert in this area. Do you want to address that?
Can you repeat? I didn't really hear it well.
So this was Wajit's question about FDI in the ready-made garment industry in Bangladesh and Cambodia. So, okay. And we know that Cambodia, there's a huge amount of direct FDI, foreign ownership of factories. I guess there's less, or maybe it's a different set of conditions in Bangladesh. You know something about this, right? So can I ask you to handle that part?
Okay. I guess in terms of FDI, I have little information about Bangladesh, but according to what I see is the policy on FDI in Bangladesh is relatively more strict than what happened in Cambodia or other ASEAN countries. For example, FDI is allowed more if firms go into export processing zone. But if it is outside export processing zone, firm would have to subject to many more rules. And that can be imagines that it add more cost of doing business in Bangladesh for foreign firms than what happened in Cambodia. But even with that conditions, right? Competitiveness of Bangladesh, which is coming from labor cost, coming from privilege as the under EBA or LDC status is still making Bangladesh attractive for multinational corporations in garment sectors and textile sectors, which a lot of them doing business in Bangladesh, even if it is not 100% owned firms, is run through joint ventures type of investments or licensings or contractual type of procurements, which is, again, we still consider it as one species linking to FDI, because there would be capital inputs flowing, even if it is not in terms of money, but in terms of technology, information, linking to what you have to comply to international standards or brand standards. It is a soft form of capital movement within the firm as well, although it's not fully in 100% FDI investment. So I would say that FDI play a role to Bangladesh competitiveness in garment sectors, especially examples are a lot with Nike, with many brands exporting from Bangladesh. And it would be even more competitive if we could make FDI easier, plus more mechanisms that allow technology transfer, IP, and other things to formulate more properly in Bangladesh, which might be having to move from RMG to other sectors, which is the way that Cambodia is also moving on. Cambodia has started from footwear, RMG, and now they tap into electronics, although it's not sophisticated, but they also doing that as well.
Thanks, Vitada. And to the second part of your question, Wajid, you mentioned that there are producers in Bangladesh in the garment industry who are LEED certified, who are complying with international environmental standards. And I think I heard you say that they're not seeing a price premium as a reward for doing that. I don't know the evidence on that. I do know that in a later module, we'll be talking about those kinds of certification measures or efforts by firms in developing countries. And a lot of the evidence shows that there is a price premium. I guess it varies by product. It may vary by country as well. So I'm not sure in the ready-made garment industry what kind of price premium is typical, if any, in that industry. Certainly when it comes to things like coffee, even timber, seafoods, other things like that, we know that consumers in wealthy countries are demonstrably willing to pay a premium for products which are environmentally certified in one way or another. So I'd be kind of surprised if there was no premium at all or no return on investments in higher environmental standards in the ready-made garment industry, but I don't know. So that's something I'll have to learn more about. Thank you for your questions.
I have a feeling that if you ask firms, they will always complain that there is no price premium. It's their job to complain. But there may be price premium, or it is not seeing as price premium because market is so competitive. So you cannot raise price. But if you don't meet this standard, actually you're out of the market. You cannot export at all. So if you compare in terms of price, not difference, but it's like you have to do it or you won't export.
Thanks. I was also wondering whether it was the competitive issue. Thanks to both of you.
Yes. You know, an interesting dimension of this, and we do talk about this in a later module, is the role played by foreign consumers. So at my university, for example, I sat for several years on a committee which was formed after the Rana Plaza incident in Bangladesh. And for those who don't know or don't remember, Rana Plaza was a horrific industrial accident in which a building collapsed and more than 1,000 people were killed. So that led to a big change in external attitudes towards the labor standards and building standards and other standards applied by Bangladeshi producers of ready-made garments. My university in America was one of many which then set about evaluating who was supplying branded clothing and equipment for its athletics programs, for its sports teams and other things like that. And the outcome of that process was a couple of measures. One was called the Accord, and I forget what the other one was called, in which companies doing business in Bangladesh, that is foreign companies doing business in Bangladesh, committed to do business only with companies that met certain kinds of standards. So it may be that there is no price premium for meeting environmental standards, but rather that the producers of goods that meet those standards are actually capturing a larger share of the market. And that would be an interesting possibility to explore.
There definitely has been consolidation. The larger exporters are getting larger, while the smaller ones, medium ones, are being wiped out or consolidated. Yes.
Okay, so thank you for that. That was an interesting set of possibilities to discuss.
May I include in this matter some comments, because I am from Bangladesh and I know the present situation in Bangladesh. And my PhD, I'm a PhD research fellow, and my research field is environmental law. Here, what is happened is everything is written in our law. We have our labor law, we have our environmental law, but it's very easy to get certificate from the Environment Authority and Labor Authority. For this reason, the compliance of the third party, sometimes RAP, ISO, actually the garments factory owner, they are bound to follow the buyer's requirement. There are a lot of loopholes in the laws, so it's very easy to get remedy from the legal point of view. And Accord try their level best to give some instruction after Rana Plaza incident. But what's happened, that's Accord jurisdiction was challenged by the Supreme Court of Bangladesh. As a result, later on, Accord cannot play a vital role here. But one thing you may think, Ian, that is very interesting. FDI is very interesting matter because we want FDI. When FDI come in textile sector, FDI come in power sector, if international UN authority, they include some condition in the following FDI. That's FDI must be FDI must be used with environmental or green sector. In that case, it may be a good decision. But I think FDI come without any regulation in Bangladesh. As FDI is go to different power plant, different textile unit. We have a lot of government is growing a lot of economic zone. So it's contaminating our various river. In some of the river, the water is it's poisonous already. So I think FDI regulation from the UN body is very much essential in this field.
Okay, thank you for that comment. It sounds interesting. I'm not 100% sure that an outside agency like the UN can be any more effective than the domestic government in designing, implementing, and enforcing environmental regulations. But I guess, in many cases, when governments are weak or when institutions are weak as well, then it helps to have support from an outside agency to encourage or to, I guess, create an environment in which better regulations can be implemented and enforced. So that's an interesting perspective. Thank you.
Okay, I see one comment about whether EU standard is something applicable to other countries from India's perspective. This is from Chetan Sharma. And again, kind of environment issue from Rajashi. He mentioned China. China is the biggest contributor to emission, but trade volume is the largest. How this explained in terms of those scale, composition, and technique effects?
Can you repeat the China part again, please?
Because China is the biggest emissions, and the fact is China has the largest trade volumes. How can this be explained in terms of scale, composition, and technique effects?
Oh, I see. Okay. So 2 questions, right? The first on the applicability of EU rules. Well, yeah, I think we all know the answer to that, that it's really difficult to imagine a set of rules that would be uniform for every country and applicable in every place. And indeed, there's no real reason to even try to apply such rules, because every country has its own is on its own trajectory and is at its own point in terms of economic development. And it's a very common thing that we hear from the developing world. Hey, you guys, the rich guys, you all depleted your environmental assets and polluted your rivers in order to get rich, and why can we not do the same thing now? Why do we have to comply with a much tighter set of environmental regulations? And the answer, I think the answer to that is, well, every country should decide what it's willing to tolerate on the path to economic growth. And that's a domestic conversation that every country should have. Foreigners or importers of your goods in the rest of the world can have a say in that. They can say, we're willing to buy more of this product or that product if you apply environmental standards. But really, that's a domestic conversation for countries to have, which is why I keep coming back to this 2 targets, 2 instrument kind of conversation. As for China, well, China is, by some measures, the world's largest economy, right? It's certainly the world's largest trading economy, and it has the largest emissions as well. These are well-known stylized facts, I guess. As for the largest emissions part, we're measuring what comes out of China, but of course, when China is the world's largest trading economy, then lots of other countries are also depleting their resources and spoiling their own environment in order to sustain growth of the Chinese economy. So the problem is actually global. It's not just about China. We know that China is very heavily dependent on coal. About 2/3 of China's electricity is still generated by burning coal, even though the Chinese coal fleet, the system of power plants, is on average quite a lot cleaner than the coal fleet in, for example, the United States. They use newer technologies and cleaner technologies. Even in spite of that, China's emissions of greenhouse gases, primarily from its steel industry and its fertilizer industry, and above all, from its power generation industry, place it in the front rank, place it at the top of the global emitters. So really, that's all about scale effects. Really big economy, very heavily engaged in international trade, and a very dirty economy, especially in terms of how it generates its electricity.
Yeah, I think we really have to move on from environment and go to poverty. I think we should next time, if we run this facilitate session again, we will have live session on environment, live session
only
on poverty.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Okay. Questions about poverty. I see that Rajashi mentions about redistribution of income is a major assumption for trade to impact SDGs. But in reality, income divide between wealthy and poor is actually increasing. Can you give some examples of how this can be addressed?
Okay. Does the questioner want to elaborate on the question at all?
Yeah, Rajashi. If we don't have enough time for answering all these questions, I will migrate these questions to the chat of the class, and
okay.
Ian will go back to it. Right.
With my free time, sure. Yeah. Okay, so well, maybe I can go ahead and try to answer what I heard there anyway. Yeah. Okay. So one thing about inequality is not always a bad thing, right? And when we really care about inequality is when we see a correspondence between inequality and poverty. Now, international trade, it's very, very difficult to find convincing evidence that international trade increases poverty anywhere. If you have a convincing example of that, I'd like to see it. But in general, trade increases incomes, and the distribution of gains may be unequal in the economy, but it's very unusual. It would be very, very unusual to see increases in absolute poverty. And that would be the dimension of inequality that we really care about. So in a way, I'm less interested in rising inequality as long as it's not extreme, and as long as it's not the kind of inequality which is accompanied by lower absolute income or real income for the poorer part of the population. So that's my quick answer to that.
Treasury or someone who put this question, are you happy? If you have follow-up questions, please turn on your mic. If not, I will move on. That is the, okay.
Yes, thank you. I think that answers my question. But this is a pressing problem in many developing countries where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. But I agree to your point that overall poverty situation has improved in all these countries. And if that is the goal of trade, that goal is achieved in terms of the SDGs. But thank you for that answer.
Yeah, let me just come back at you a little bit on something that you said there. You said that it's often the case that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. I disagree. I think that what we really see, and it should be a concern, but a lesser concern, is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are also getting richer, but not as fast. And that's a different kind of a concern, right? If the poor are really getting poorer, then absolute poverty is increasing, and that is a very, very serious problem. That's SDG 1, and there's a reason why SDG 1 is number 1, end poverty. It's because that's the most serious problem of all. But I don't believe it's the case that international trade in the developing world increases poverty. I don't have any evidence that happens anywhere. What I do see, and it should be a concern, but a lesser concern, as I said, is that the distribution of gains may be such that wealthy people, or at least some wealthy people, become richer much faster, and some poorer people also become richer, but more slowly. And you know, what we see everywhere around the world is that countries which engage in trade and which become more open to trade, almost without exception, also achieve much, much lower poverty. And so by that absolute measure, I think we should be happy.
That's true. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can answer only just 2 or 3 more questions from now, and the rest have to be dealt in the class chat in the ESCAP community. Tafael, you asked questions about food health security. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the nice session. My question is, we always talk about comparative advantage. When we talk about comparative advantage, we always use our factor of production in the best and effective and efficient use. Now, for the poor countries like ours, Bangladesh, or developing countries, when we use all the factors of productions for a certain sector, if it is not a food sector, then gradually we depend on some other countries for our food. Now, during crisis, what will happen when the food prices increase? Because suppose we have focused on our garment sector only, okay, and we do not produce food in hypothetical situation, and there is a war around the world, and the food price is increasing because we are not having enough foreign exchange from the garment sector. So how shall we manage that food security? Even during pandemic time, we have found that for vaccines, the developing and poor countries actually were very worried. because they didn't have enough money to collect the vaccine. So how international trade can help us ensure this food and health security? If you could explain, I would just love to hear about that. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot to talk about there. Thank you, Tafael. So I think your starting point was that if we create a lot of jobs in industry and like ready-made garments, then there may be a shortage of labor in agriculture and food production may not grow as fast. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not sure how widespread that phenomenon really is. Let's take Bangladesh, your country. What we know about the ready-made garment industry in Bangladesh is that it has brought a lot of new workers into the labor force who were not previously employed or were not previously fully employed. And I'm thinking in particular of women, of course. So the productivity of those jobs is much higher than the productivity of jobs that women had previously when they were in rural areas, maybe working in a family business or on the farm, or employed much fewer hours or fewer days in the month as well. So part of what you said, I think we have to be careful in making that assertion that just because we add jobs in one sector, we necessarily take away jobs in another sector. That may be true in some cases, but I would say not generally true. But the second part of your question, I think, is a very real concern. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, not only with COVID, but of course this year, 2022, with the outbreak of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, is a huge spike in global food prices. And that accompanying breakdown in global food trade is a very, very big and very serious concern for lots of countries in the developing world who are themselves net food importers. I don't think that's a consequence of competition for resources like labor within the country. I think that's a global market shock, which has to be addressed in a very different kind of way. And I know that some countries are responding by saying, okay, we need to be more food secure. That is, we need to be more self-sufficient, have higher food stocks, ensure that we are more resilient to a global supply failure of the kind that happened during this year. And I can understand that very well. But that's kind of a long-term issue. It has to do with investments in agricultural productivity, with supply chains, with storage facilities, other things like that, which are, I think, very big policy issues and very big concerns at the country level. But I don't think those things are directly linked to shortage of labor, in most cases at least, to shortage of labor due to the growth of non-agricultural industries.
So thank you very much for your explanation. Just I will add one comment with your explanation. That is, when you talk about that there is no real possibility of shortage of labor, my question is because suppose in our country, what has happened? We have got enough investment and we have got enough opportunity in the garment sector jobs. Mm-hmm. So because in this course, I have seen that when the job sector is opening, the skilled workers and others started to get higher wages. Right. So these higher wages will attract people from other sectors to join that sector, leaving that sector behind because that is not producing enough wage. So in that way, redistribution of labor forces will actually create the problem that I am talking about. I think we can have more discussions later, but that was my comment. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you again. That clarified things. If you look in the B modules, there is a module in there which has to do with food security and food self-sufficiency. And the second part of that module directly addresses the concern that you raise. So in there, you're going to find that food self-sufficiency is in that module. You'll find that food self-sufficiency is typically not the right target for a country to try to achieve, but that through technical progress in agriculture, and in particular through the substitution of capital inputs, for example, tractors, for labor inputs, agriculture can become more productive in response to higher labor costs. And I think that's really, that's going to be the trend in Bangladesh, as it has been, of course, everywhere else in the wealthy world. If we think about my country, America, then what we see there is in the course of about 150 years, starting from the middle of the 19th century, there was a huge sequence of changes in agricultural production, which every one of which substituted some form of capital or knowledge embodied in capital for labor. So as labor became scarcer and more costly, people found ways to produce the same amount of food or even more food using less labor. And so the development of tractors, the development of combine harvesters, the development of new varieties of crop, all of these things were directed at maintaining or increasing agricultural production using less labor in the field. And I think that's the long-term or the medium to long-term response to the problem that you've raised.
Okay, thank you. Just one more thing. Would you also suggest about having a special trade agreement with the food producing countries where, which also might help in the crisis? Because if any country doesn't produce, doesn't fail to increase the productivity in agriculture sector, then he or that country can have an agreement with the other countries, food producing or agro producing countries, yep, which can also ensure the food problem during crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. A really quick off-the-cuff response to that would be those agreements will only be valid so long as there is no crisis. So imagine that your country, imagine Ukraine is a very, very big food exporter in the world market, right? So imagine that your country had signed an agreement with Ukraine, thinking that this will be stable, this will ensure our food supply. Well, that agreement would be worthless by now, right? So I think it's not necessarily a long-term solution, but thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we are 8 minutes over time, and that I'm still seeing many interesting questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is I will take the questions that we haven't answered into the class chat, and also we will bring it up on the 28th November because we will have many guest speakers who may have different ideas to also add to the issue as well. So please come back on 28th, but we will start at 1 p.m. Bangkok time on 28th November. So 1 hour earlier than today class. So please remember that difference. Ian, you have your last word.
I want to thank you all for coming. I'm super impressed by the numbers of people participating and by the quality and the focus of the questions that you were asking as well. You really challenged me. I had to think fast, and I hope I was able to answer your questions adequately. I'm loving this course. It's really lots of fun to produce and lots of fun to interact with the rest of you. And I look forward to seeing you all again on the 28th.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ian.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
See you in 10 days.
Thank you.